And you are now live.
Right. So this is continuation of Senate Appropriations testimony on the 2022 budget, and we are taking up the Agency of Education. And so I see the Secretary, French, is here. If you want to introduce your staff that you have with you today for the committee, and then what we will do is have you, I assume you might have documents or screen sharing. The one thing is, as you may know from Senate Appropriations, the level of detail that we want to get into in terms of the budget is probably not at the same level as you might have done in the House. But we'd like kind of the high points if you've got initiatives and anything substantial changes as it relates to the agency's budget. Would be particularly helpful. So I'm going to let you take it from here, Secretary French, introduce your staff, and then if you want screen sharing, we can arrange for that.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. It's good to see you all. Dan French, Secretary of Education. And we have several agency staff here today. Bill Bates, who you might remember from last year, he's the CFO of the agency. And perhaps a new face, Jill Briggs Campbell, who's been, I think Jill was hired right before the COVID emergency. We did meet each other in person at some point, but for the most part, we've been working remotely. And she's been leading up a number of projects, but in particular, the management of our federal dollars relative to the COVID relief. So we have a presentation and materials we can supply the committee, and Bill will lead that, but I'll just at a high level, I can break that down into three parts. One is sort of a traditional presentation on our budget proposal, which just, to recap, the Agency of Education, 160 employees, basically supervises the K-12 education system, doesn't rely on a lot of general fund, relatively speaking, largely administers federal grants and oversees the K-12 system. Nothing really going on in our budget relative to new programs or initiatives. The other piece we usually include is some information, I just call it information, on the education fund. We have other staff who could be available, namely Brad James and so forth, who I'm sure you're familiar with, who can go into that in greater detail. But we usually include that in our annual budget presentation because it's a common point of confusion sometimes if people think the education fund supports the cost of the Agency of Education, and it's just a nominal administration fee that we do receive to manage that. But no, the education fund does not fund the agency. But last, which is new, we thought you might be interested in it, and it's something we're interested in, and which is why Jill is here, is to speak about the federal education dollars relative to COVID relief. So we do have a separate presentation on that, 4 or 5 slides, which gets into quite a bit of detail, but we thought it would be useful background information if you don't have some of that fluency, and we'd like to speak with you a little bit about that today. It's not necessarily germane to our budget per se at the moment, but it's certainly front burner for us managing our pandemic response. So we can start with the budget overview. Not sure you're going to want to go slide by slide. And
no, your instincts are correct.
So
we want the cliff notes.
Yeah. I appreciate that. So I don't know, Bill, if we could put Bill in the driver's seat on that to share his screen is probably the easiest thing to do. And
Chrissy, may I have screen sharing?
Yes, I made you a co-host, so you should be all set.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And I'll sort of go very quickly and sort of set the tone for this, and then invite Bill to make some comments, but we can go as fast as slow as you want on this. I would, again, like to take some time on the federal dollars in particular. But the budget presentation, there's not a lot going on. And again, we'll have some information on the education fund, but that's usually a topic that we examine in more detail in another setting. But if we just, Bill, go ahead and click through. So, just a general overview. Here's a, essentially what the agency does again, in case you just remind you, essentially we oversee the K-12 education system. We don't really have a lot of interaction with higher education. Some states, that's not necessarily the case. Okay, go ahead, Bill. So, Just the real what's going on basically from a budgetary perspective. I think, as we were working on the budget, like most agencies, we didn't really know what future revenue projections would be. And certainly a lot of what we've had to do in terms of COVID is it's a fundamental change in many of the functions that the agency's been doing. I mean, really, prior to the COVID emergency, we had very little operational oversight of the K-12 education system. And I would say, an exception to that would be our student meals program. But certainly, as a result of COVID, we've had to make substantial changes, sort of on a temporary basis, to support the emergency response. And as you know, we've been feeding kids nonstop since the beginning of the emergency. That's been running essentially 24/7 throughout the summer vacations. So that's been a critical piece. I think at one point in August, I think our staff had requested over 30 some odd waivers from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to keep those programs running. It's been challenging, but also very rewarding work and very successful work. We've had to, stand up a whole remote learning support aspect. We have state infrastructure that's involved with that, with the Vermont Virtual Learning Cooperative, and working with partners across the state, helping schools stand up largely for the first time entire curriculums in remote learning. Big part of our response has been in the communication sphere, really from the beginning. I think either today, perhaps, is the 1-year anniversary of shutting down our school system last spring. We have a seat at the table, if you will, in the State Emergency Operations Center once that went live. And continually since that moment last year, twice a day, our internal emergency operations team meets first thing in the morning and then again at the afternoon, and that's been continuous. So we've had to bring different people from different aspects of the agency together to staff that and to manage that communications. It's been a significant part of our response. If you go on our website, you can just see the documents and so forth, the guidance that's been published. It's significant. And then lastly, not to underestimate it, but a significant aspect of our work, which is more or less where we've always been involved, but standing up all the different federal financial programs that have been involved, going back to the CARES Act and what I'll call ESSER 1, 2, and now ESSER 3, GEAR, ENES program for independent schools. All those programs had to be created from scratch, grant applications deployed online, the monitoring and oversight, auditing, and so forth had to be deployed. So there's been a significant activity in our financial and management section of the agency, which Bill coincidentally is the head of as well. So I'll just that's a real just sort of snapshot of what's been going on. If you want to hit the slide, Bill. But basically, looking on that, we aren't anticipating new positions. We are, since last year, we, at one point when I started as secretary, I guess I'm coming up on my 3rd year, we had 25 vacancies. We are more or less fully staffed at this point. We still have some vacancies, but it's sort of the normal turnover, not the deficit we were. So we've brought all our line leaders on, filled those positions. Our staffing has been relatively stable.
Secretary, if I could just interrupt. I remember the prior secretary, Rebecca Holcomb, had left a number of vacancies because she was thinking about how to restructure and organize the agency more to align with today's requirements, demands, and needed expertise, but you said you filled them. I was just wondering, did you do a lot of changes in terms of job descriptions or functions as part of that process?
Yeah, I think 2 areas I'd mention along the line of your question, Madam Chair. One is data, which is an integral part of what we do as an agency. It informs virtually all aspects of our operations. And previously, more or less all the data staff of the agency were dispersed among various teams. And it was something I think that Secretary Holcomb had been working on, and the moment arrived when I came on board to actually enact that, which was to create a standalone data division inside the agency. So basically all those individuals were brought back into a single structure, into a new entity, a division of data management. We have a PhD level data scientist, Dr. Wendy Geller, who leads that work. And it allowed us to really start to work on some of the modernization issues that have been sort of lagging, and a lot of what we call technical deficit at the agency. So that was a significant change. The other thing that comes to mind when I hear your question is I would just mention special education. It wasn't so much that we were anticipating, I would say, modernizing that approach, but we just had a series of retirements that were very unfortunate relative to the fact that we also had a major new policy in the area of special ed reform in Act 173. So right about when I came on board, we had the division director. Our divisions are 20 to 30 people. A division director turnover in the division where special ed resides in our organizational chart. We had the state director of special education retire. I think the deputy director of the division retired. So we literally had all the major leadership positions in our special ed chain of command were gone. And that really put us, I would say, under the water to a certain extent relative to implementing Act 173. So we've had some very successful hires in that regard. Once again, a lot of stability now in those areas. So those are two major areas. I think, in terms of restructuring, the one area that's still coming up to speed a bit is the finance and management division. And certainly COVID has put additional strain there. But what I characterized, and Bill's fairly new. We in that division, we sort of had an inch deep and a mile wide, what I'd call the Bill Talbot organizational chart. So Bill carried a lot of things in his head, God bless him, and Brad is in that similar vein. So we had a lot of individuals really bright who were one-offs. There was very little organizational depth. So if Bill Talbot called in sick for a month, time stopped on certain operational aspects of the agency, and that's not a good thing. So we have created we have the CFO position. The Bill's the new CFO, who's been on the job for a while now, and a deputy CFO to sort of build in that piece of it. But then we've been working in a similar vein to sort of build in more of sort of that vertical structure and team so that we're not so vulnerable for individuals. And we also have a couple key retirements coming up in the near future. So we want to make sure their expertise and institutional knowledge is well embedded in the new staff. But Jill's example, a great example of some of our best and brightest new hires. So we're really pleased. We've been successful in our recruiting process. So that's a quick walk around that topic. Do mention, we had back in January talking about the issue of the state board. And that's sort of on the back burner right now, but that's an area we're interested in, the regulatory aspects, because that's a place where we do lose some capacity there. Well, I would say lose, but we spend quite a bit of time interacting with the state board. And then I think you're aware we had proposed moving the child or a section of the child development division to the agency. So those were the two big sort of restructuring things. They're not in our budget. They were policy areas we just wanted to highlight back when we were formulating our budget presentation. I think it's fair to say the state board conversation, I know Senator Bruce has a lot of knowledge on this topic. This is something that will probably be taken up at a future date. In the CDD, I don't think it gained a lot of traction, but that's still out there from an organizational change perspective. I know there's initiative around some of the planning and childcare and so forth. But at the time, I just wanted to highlight them as part of our budget presentation. But once again, these were things that would be off in the future. They're not really relevant to what we're proposing in terms of a budget. So I'll keep moving along unless you stop me. So, again, I would just characterize this, happy to get into all kinds of detail on these issues, but essentially, as we were doing our budget planning, we did not propose any significant changes. And this is, again, at the time when we really didn't know what was coming relative to state revenues. We knew that federal dollars were coming in to support some of the COVID activities, but we had a less clear, I guess, sense of how Vermont would be faring after the emergency. And of course, I think since November, revenue projections have been up, certainly buoyed by the federal revenues, but we feel more confident the financial picture is becoming better. But it was, I would say, crisis, but we were very concerned of an uncertain future for the state, and we're preparing to put a very tight budget together to do that. And that's essentially where we ended up in terms of our budget proposal. But once again, no significant changes, and I don't know how much detail you want to get into, but we're happy to do that. Bill, you want to just keep going, and I'll.
Yeah. Any questions, committee? Okay.
There's basically two areas of appropriation. In terms of our budget, we have the finance administration B500 and then education services B501. And this is a sort of a initial or sort of the high level organizational chart, just to give you a sense of how that lays out.
Secretary French, if I could
Yeah, go
chime
ahead,
in
Bill.
real quick. For the committee, you see under the CFO, you have finance and admin, and then you also have the data management team that Secretary French spoke to. One of the things that I have placed a lot of emphasis on is filling vacancies within the finance and admin section. And I'm pleased to say that of the 9 vacancies that currently exist across the entire agency, we've just filled the Director of Regulatory Compliance, because Sandra Ryan's name might ring a bell to many of you, and she has just accepted the Director of Regulatory Compliance position. She's been on board for just about a month now, and next week I am actively interviewing for a new accountant. So 2 of those 9 will be filled within the next month, and we have plans for filling those other positions.
Since we have this slide, back to sort of the COVID theme, Ted Fisher on the far right there, Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs. I will say one area we have felt a lot of pressure in relative to the COVID response is reflected in Mr. Fisher, who's been wearing a couple different hats. In this chart, he's listed as Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs. You might remember seeing him around the State House. He has also been our sort of point person on emergency management. So when we took on recently some of the planning and operational oversight of the vaccination program for K-12 schools, his team sort of has led that work. So he has a different team under him, and it's put a lot of stress on the agency to maintain the good communications and so forth. And we're getting along, but we are planning to beef up this team by pulling some positions from other areas. And primarily, we had essentially back to this idea of embedded positions. We had embedded web liaisons in each of the teams, more or less. So to try to bring those together to create a bigger communications team where people can wear multiple hats. We've had difficulty, frankly, navigating the legislative session this year. Because Mr. Fisher, typically a one-person show, as we try to manage your requests and be responsive to your needs. But it's been challenging while simultaneously managing an unprecedented global pandemic of the same shop. So we've been stressed in that area. So we appreciate your flexibility and patience. If you want to move along, Bill. Yeah, so I don't know how much of this detail, Bill. I'm going to push it along. We can go into these issues. Bill, click another slide.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm going to keep going. We can go through all these. Again, there's nothing
No,
really.
I was going to say a 0.9%.
Yeah.
No, I don't think there's anything.
So I would encourage you, I don't know how much time we have, but I'd really like to spend some time on the federal dollars because I think it'll bring us back to some of this.
Senator Starr?
Yeah, before we get to the federal dollars, yeah, Ted Fisher's been before my committee several times, Mr. Secretary, and done a very good job doing his job. And if he didn't have the and came back. But what I was going to ask you about, you're talking about vacancies in federal dollars. A lot of that money has come into Vermont to feed children and through the school system. And I think Rosie gets swamped with work trying to keep up with all the different regs, and we're also in the legislature, we've been working on the universal meals program, and I don't know how it's going to turn out, but she has said that she would need another person if we push that along. And I don't know why it's been difficult to get these positions filled over in the ed agency for some reason. And I'm really glad to hear that you're at least filling some of them. And I was wondering if you'd look at Rosie's area in the meals part?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the question, Senator. It's a critical program, and Rosie does a phenomenal job.
Yeah.
She is stretched exceedingly thin pre-COVID, and she's one of our rock stars in terms of COVID response. We do need to add staff there at some point. What I'm proposing as a solution is actually a proposal on simplifying the home study regulations. That's another sort of lesson learned from our COVID response. We've had basically over 100% increase in the amount of home studies. And what that did really put a lot of pressure on our agency to manage. We had to bring, again, sort of all hands on deck, bringing staff from other areas of the agency to support. But what it did expose for us is the fact that one of the reasons we struggled is our regulations are relatively overly complex in home study. And it's still largely a paper process, and for whatever reason. So we did some research looking around other, particularly northern New England states, and acknowledged that our regulations and our statutory language is overly complex. We sort of worked out what we call a simplification of home study regulations and statutory language, and we've come to, I think, a strong support from the home study community to do that. If you've dealt with that advocacy community, that's not an easy accomplishment. So I think it's a win-win. It's something we would like to see happen. It's sort of ending up as a miscellaneous education topic, if you will. But if that were enacted, we'd have the ability to move people from that function over into the food service function.
Oh.
So through essentially a simplification process of regulation, we'd be able to reduce a burden on the agency in one area and add capacity to another area.
That would require a statutory change, Secretary?
Yes, but it's not overly significant. It's really a function of getting the stakeholders involved and really simplifying as opposed to adding language. So we have that. The Senate Ed Committee's seen it, but I'm worried. But with COVID being such a prominent thing, I pitched it as this sort of way. Here's a place, because the home study folks are situated in the same federal division. We call it Federal Education Program Division as our food service folks. So it really is quite simple from an organizational standpoint to literally move people from one cubicle to another. But that's an area we think we could improve both the service to home study parents and families and still provide the adequate state oversight of those programs, but also create additional capacity for a more, I would say, more critical area, but an area we certainly benefit from having more capacity. So I just put that bug in your ear.
Right. You've got two ex-committee chairs, education committee chairs sitting right here. Just send us the info.
Yeah, that observation was not lost on me. So,
except we're not the policy committee, so I think we might have a jurisdictional problem here. It doesn't sound like this is something that's moving this legislative year, then, I was hoping it would. In the House.
I was hoping it would, and I'll do my best to keep telling it to anyone I run into. But I think it's because it was perceived, it is rightfully a miscellaneous topic. And of course, when I think from a legislative process, when you hear home study, if you've been involved in that conversation, the advocacy and if you're sizing up how much time is involved in that, it might appear to be more complex than it is. But this is a win-win for everyone, I assure you. But it sort of slipped below the radar a little bit, and I've tried to elevate it recently, particularly around the momentum for universal meals, because I think it's a one way we could address that issue, because we will need additional staff to operate that program on that scale. So,
well, it's going to take more than additional staff by the looks of the appropriation in it.
But, yes.
But also, if this is something that makes sense, we just passed a miscellaneous ed bill, which would go to the House. So I would think that there might be an opportunity, if this is straightforward, to see if they would be interested in including it in that bill.
No, absolutely. We're going to do our best to do that, and we've had some outreach from them already on miscellaneous topics. So we hope to make some progress there.
Okay. All right.
Good.
Okay. We'll move on. I'm gonna try to move us into the federal funds. Bill, why don't you advance the slides a little bit?
Yep. So Secretary French, one thing that we'll want to do is spend some time on slide 15. So I'll jump ahead to that slide right now. So, Madam Chair and committee members, what you have here is the list of IT projects that are requiring funding. So, Madam Chair, at the beginning of the meeting, you had asked if there were any changes. This is what I would consider falling into that bucket.
So are these ones recommended by the administration as part of their IT funding package of 52 million?
They're not.
They are not. So
Okay.
pre-COVID, they were going to be in our budget. COVID hit, and then we took them out of the budget, thinking that we might be able to get them added to the ADS IT project pool. We have found out since providing testimony over on the House side that they did not make the IT project pool. And so we are now seeking funding for these 3 strategic projects: dual enrollment, education licensing, and then adult literacy. The project cost, this is implementation costs to complete the one-time project work, is just a little over $4 million for these 3 projects.
I see. And so this is a funding request that the administration supporting over and above the governor's budget proposal then?
That's correct.
Yes.
We've kicked the tires on a number of issues, whether we could use our federal COVID dollars. It doesn't appear to be a good fit. And also these are ongoing costs. Just to give you an example, like the education licensing system, this is the information system that manages teacher licensing. Our current system that's mentioned, Afient, it's been on sort of this perpetual renewal cycle. We've gotten extensions and extensions and extensions. It's a pretty mediocre platform, but when we go out to bid and look at what's out in the marketplace, the cost of doing a new system is going to be substantially higher than the mediocre system that we have now, which is really offset to a certain extent by the cost of teacher licensing fees. That's not really going to be a cost model that works, and we're going to have to replace the system at some point. So we've been thinking of, okay, is that appropriate use of COVID funds? Probably not. How about the education fund? Well, I don't know. But we've got a couple of these that are sort of in that same vein, and dual enrollment and adult literacy, similar kind of deal. Dual enrollment's been funded out of the ed fund per se. We've never really had a good system for managing sort of the vouchers, the paperwork, and so forth. That was a program that was stood up that really, from my perspective, wasn't adequately supported from an administrative perspective. And similar with adult ed. So they're kind of these programs that are important through our K through 16 perspective, but we never really truly accounted. I'm saying all of us haven't really accounted for what it costs to run these programs. So these costs are percolating up, and we've got to find a solution for them.
So these are ongoing costs then.
These implementation costs are high. They're one time because they're all looking at implementing new systems. So there'll be a transition and sort of implementation costs relative to training and so forth to bring them online. Then the future costs are much lower, and we can get into that in more detail. But
so I'm a little confused on the 4 million. Does that actually fund the acquisition of the software, replacement software?
yes.
It does. Okay.
But Dan, with your home studies doubling in numbers, dual enrollment, hopefully that's gone up. Aren't some of these issues caused by COVID, and couldn't you use that as an excuse to use the federal money to help pay for these things?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think in terms of home study, it's not clear if the numbers are going to come back down after COVID. We certainly see.
You go and ask before the numbers go down.
Yeah.
You ask while the numbers are
Yeah.
I guess the other question is whether in fact there's some of the ESSER money that could be used for things that are currently funded right now and free up the equivalent funds to support this and swap it out. I think.
Yeah, I would agree. That's probably the more, something like education licensing, I think and I'm fairly creative, but that would be a stretch for me to qualify that as a COVID expense. if we want to move on, but thanks, Bill, for bringing
Yeah.
that up, because that's an issue we should ask to call your attention to.
All right, thank you.
And so I'm happy to stop sharing at this point because the rest of this presentation is Ed Fund, but we wanted to spend some time on COVID. But I'm happy.
So why don't we do that? And Jill, do you have those slides, or who has?
Jill has those slides.
Yeah, why don't we have?
I do,
and
yeah.
once again, we're happy to come and talk in more detail about the Ed Fund and so forth. But I know Brad's been wandering around talking about that. But we've prepared a fairly concise presentation, but with a lot of detail on what we call ESSER, which is the Elementary Secondary Education Emergency Relief. This is one of the primary sources of COVID relief that's being focused on K-12. And I don't know if it was on your radar last summer. It was 31 million last summer, but the number
Yeah,
is
it was
growing.
on our radar.
Yeah, it's now the new appropriations are much larger. So we have ESSER 1, 2, and 3, and Jill will give you sort of a high.
Yeah, I
overview.
think we're talking about 380 million, maybe between the three.
Yeah, sounds about right.
All right. So I'm going to sort of start at the beginning just to make sure that we're all on the same page. As we all know, it's a bit of an alphabet soup at this point. So stop me if I'm going into too much detail, and I'm happy to sort of skim. So I just wanted to, sort of level set here. We've had 3 major COVID relief bills. Each of them has had their own ESSER. CARES, which passed back in March of last year. And of course, CARES is also the bill that I've commonly heard referenced in the legislature as being sort of a shorthand for CRF. But for Agency of Education, we had a specific set of programs within CARES, and that's ESSER, GEAR, which is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, and then of course CRF. CARISA, as we're calling it, as our shorthand, was passed in December of 2020. This was a substantial increase, which we'll see the numbers in just a moment, and included ESSER 2, GEAR 2, which also sits with the governor's office, and the priorities for those funds are yet to be determined. GEAR EANS, which is a specific support for our independent schools, an extension of CRF through 12/31 of this year, and then some additional emergency funding for child nutrition. And then, of course, we have the American Rescue Plan, or ARPA, which just passed. This includes ESSER 3. It does not include a GEAR 3. It includes a GEAR EANS 2, so an addition to the independent school, and then a supplement to IDEA.
And IDEA is special ed funding.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I made a bit of a family tree with each of the details here. What is important to note is that the ESSER funding comes through the U.S. Department of Education. CRF came through Treasury. So very different sort of requirements go along with that, and it's just sort of important to note that. The ESSER funds are not competitive, just to clarify. I've seen some confusion about that maybe some of our smaller districts aren't able to compete for the funds. It's based on a formula, and the formula is related to our Title I counts. It's not part of Title I. So that formula generates an allocation for each LEA. There's no competition around it. So everyone's going to get their allocation.
LEA is school district.
Yeah, school district or supervisory union or district.
Yes, local education. All right.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Thank you. And thanks, Dan. Please jump in. These just roll trippingly off my tongue at this point, so please interrupt. And ESSER does include a broad range of allowable costs. A couple of things to note. So it includes anything that is allowable under our sort of regular title or federal funds, our title funds, IDEA, Perkins, and then an additional 13 allowable costs. One thing to note is that it's very clear that there has to be sort of a COVID context for whatever those costs are. So it's broad, but you must make the case that it is in response to COVID. And I think probably everybody in the committee knows this by now, but AOE cannot tell LEAs how to spend their funds. These are theirs. We're the pass-through agency. We can offer guidance and oversight, which we do. And when we receive the applications, our team reviews them to make sure that all costs are allowable and reasonable. So those are sort of our two standards for approving a particular cost. So as we all know, the money's been getting bigger, but there's a couple other things to point out here. ESSER 1 had about $28 million for the LEAs and just over $3 million in the state education agency, so that's Agency of Education, set aside. It did include equitable services to independent schools. And so this was a mechanism by which the LEAs were required to offer goods and services to independent schools within their LEA where they had students that they sent. And there's more detail on that, but we don't need to dive in too deep on that. This one goes through September of 2022. So that was the first round. ESSER 2, part of the Carissa Act, increased that bucket to $114 million with an increase to the SEA set aside, and does not include equitable services. That equitable services support for independent schools is what became the GEAR EANS program and essentially shifted the burden of equitable services onto the Agency of Education. So we are now providing the goods and services to independent schools, which is a new task for us to figure out. The LEAs do this pretty regularly with their title funds, but it's a new thing for the agency. This application
probably, and don't let me, I'm going to interrupt you, but in fact, the committee is in our bill. We have been appropriating money from the ESSER 2 out of that 12.6. We started with the BAA with the Burlington fit up request that came in, but then we've looked at other education related recommendations from our education committee. So we have just to connect the work of this committee with the ESSER 2 appropriation. So,
yeah, and in a couple of slides from here, you'll see the budget that AOE has for the SEA set aside as well. So a point of discussion, absolutely. So the application for ESSER 1 closes on the 20th, so just a few days away. So the reason we have not opened the ESSER 2 application at this point is very much tied with that. We want folks to focus on getting in their ESSER 1 applications before we turn to ESSER 2, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And Senator Starr, did you have a question?
Well, does any money left over in 1, does it automatically move to 2 if there's money left over?
So that's an excellent question, and the answer is no. So there is a deadline of April 29th of this year. Any funds that are not in a approved award for ESSER 1 must be returned to the federal government. So as you'll see in a moment, I'll show you what we've got going on with ESSER 1, but we're getting pretty close to the finish line in terms of LEA applications. So the funds do not roll over, they get sent back to the federal government, and then they will determine reallocation out to other states as need be. So we've very much been communicating that folks need to get their applications in fully budgeted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't want to send money back.
We do not. No, absolutely. All right, and so a couple of key things on ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 is that the sort of period of performance, how long the grant goes, is an additional year. So ESSER 1 goes through September of 22, ESSER 2 and 3 go through September of 23. So they've got a pretty long tail. And this is sort of part of our discussion around how we are offering guidance to the field on this. And then just very quickly, the last bucket here is ESSER 3, part of the American Rescue Plan Act. As we all know, big increase, so $256 million to LEAs. and 28 million to the SEA set aside. Again, no equitable services. A really significant change here is that ESSER 3 has some very specific mandates on how the funds must be used. And I have a slide for that in just a moment. I'll pause really quickly if there's any questions on what I've just outlined. I know it's a lot to throw at folks.
Yeah, I was thinking these would function as a good reference for the committee.
Yeah.
So we want to kind of move it along. They can dig in more details.
Absolutely. Okay. And here's sort of a graphic outlining that with the total funds at the bottom there, which is a nice reference. Okay, so I've already spoken mainly to what's going on with ESSER 1. It does close in just a few days, and we're getting very, very close to this. So 28 million is allocated for the LEAs, and we have awarded 20 million, and those applications are all pretty much in the review process as of like this morning. I checked, so we're looking pretty good on that. So here is the ESSER 1 SCA set aside budgeted. And Dan, do you want to speak to this a little bit, what we've used these funds for?
Yeah, and in large part, they're related to our communication support and then remote learning and this was all done in the spring of last year and that moment. So setting up online learning management system and then building out our Salesforce implementation to manage communications. And that's essentially, you can see we've budgeted about 1.5 million, and there's still 1.6 million left in the ESSER 1 state set aside.
Okay.
All right, ESSER 2. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, we need to find, this is to go along here.
Yeah.
We do have some context, obviously, because our joint fiscal office has been helping us with the various funding streams that have come in under the federal legislation. So, but this is helpful to put it all in one place.
And I think I probably skip this slide. The one thing I will point to is that ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 have a different maintenance of effort requirement, which I've outlined here. It's the proportional share of state spending from Agency of Education relative to other agencies.
As to some of the guardrails, we have to be careful about not supplanting essentially state dollars with federal dollars.
And Senator Kitchell, you already referenced the Burlington High School Macy's retrofit, which is currently in the ESSER 2 set aside for $3.5 million, which leaves the rest unbudgeted at this point.
Well, we're working on that.
And ESSER 3, I've already given the high level details on that. And this is some specific detail about the spending mandates. I'm going to leave this language here and just sort of point really quickly to this graphic. I think what's probably the most relevant is for the LEAs, they have a 20% spending mandate specifically around learning loss, which is outlined in the previous slide. And you'll see the SEA set aside has even more restrictions around how the funds must be spent. So this is quite different from the previous two. So I just wanted to signal that as an important piece of information to have. And then Dan, I will let you speak to this last slide.
Yeah, so we've, and I appreciate that, we've been working with the policy committees on their ideas of how to help with COVID. I just will observe in a week or so before town meeting break that many of the policy ideas didn't tag a specific funding source. And I can remember going in specifically on a literacy bill, and throughout that bill, it said needs funding source was a common theme. And I kept saying to them, well, where do you intend to fund this out of? And the answer was, oh, that's the money committees. That's the money committees, So we started to get increasingly concerned. Nature was not fully conceptualizing ESSER. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to provide this background information, because there are, particularly in this idea of long-term nature of the funds, we have a significant chunk of work still in front of us in education as a result of pandemic. We call that the recovery. So we're seeking to use these state level funds in a strategic manner And we need to focus on, I think, what, the intention, the federal intention is that those funds be focused on the recovery work. And I'm concerned that the appropriations that are coming up through this don't acknowledge the sort of that longer term trajectory. They're being sort of invested or being attached to one-off sort of strategies that might or not be related to recovery, or might not be related to COVID. So that'd be increasingly problematic. So there are three big areas that we'd like to focus the funding on, and I guess to the point that the legislature has been actively involved in spending this money, I would point out that the federal law does give some authority to the secretary to designate how these funds get used, but we certainly would want to work in partnership with on you. But there's three areas, again, in this idea of a long-term sort of approach. One is, I think, strategically, we could sort of direct these funds towards school facilities issues, including indoor air quality, health and safety issues, because as you know, we have a significant issue with school construction, and say parallel to the support of the Burlington School District. We have some facilities issues in our buildings, and these essentially one-time monies could be used to really address some of those issues. Secondly, this idea of integrated service delivery model, meaning we've been partnering with mental health, for example, and DCF, as we've been sort of planning out how we're going to support districts in this next phase of recovery work. And basically, we see the state funds functioning on issues that transcend district boundaries, that really need to speak to regional needs. In particular, we have regions of the state where the integrated delivery of model, relative to mental health in school districts, for example, isn't as robust as it should be. And we think we can use these one-time funds, not only responding to the immediate needs of education recovery in the pandemic, but also essentially leaving in the landscape afterwards a better integration and more robust delivery model of services. In particular, since Senator Starr has asked me a couple of questions, just to respond, he knows I have a specific attachment to the Northeast Kingdom. We need to do some focused work in the Northeast Kingdom right now as a result of the organizational changes that have happened in Northeast Kingdom Human Services. So once again, these dollars could be used very strategically to help incentivize and build out some of that infrastructure. And then lastly, as you heard from Jill, we have a mandate to address learning loss. So the federal dollars that are set aside at the SEA level or the agency level have restrictions on how they get used, and part of that restriction is learning loss. So before we go spending all this money in one-off strategies, at some point we need to have a strategic conversation, and I'd welcome to be part of that, at least since we're managing it, and also have some federal requirement that I do direct the use of these funds. So I just want to put that on your radar. And then also just the idea that these funds are to be used through 2023, essentially for the recovery phase. And we are just at the initial part of even trying to describe what is student need, to what extent have students been impacted from the pandemic.
Senator Starr, I think you wanted to ask a question.
Yes, I was wondering, Dan, you said the funds were going to get dispersed like according to Title I payouts. Now, is that going to go through the supervisory union that looks after Title I, or each individual school that has their own Title I?
Yeah, so that's so ESSER funds are split 90%, 10%. So 90% goes to the LEAs. LEAs are supervisory unions or supervisory districts. So the same folks that receive Title I funds and manage the federal dollars are the recipient. So the point Jill made about Title I, how do we figure out how much ESSER funds to give to each SU? That's done on a formulaic basis. It's basically the same methodology as Title I, even though it's not related to Title I.
I have a question. The technical centers, career and technical centers, they've expressed concern. Obviously, COVID has impacted their ability to recruit students. The funding mechanism is already to their disadvantage if you listen to them. And they're obviously requesting some kind of help relative to their census because of the recruitment difficulties they've experienced. With the federal money, how are these career and technical centers? How do they benefit from this money as well? And how does that happen? Is it the largesse of the the supervisory union, or is there a formula? So that's my question.
Yeah,
I
I
guess
think
Jill
it's a
wants the answer.
Yeah, I'll do it. I'll jump it quicker, and then Jill can correct me when I say is inaccurate. But the large S idea is addressed. You're correct through ESSER. If a technical center is part of a school district, I'll use Rutland as an example. Stafford Technical Center is a part of the Rutland School District. So Rutland City School District is an LEA. So it would receive ESSER funds, and how the district wants to use those funds and the permissible uses that Jill outlined through the largesse of that process, it could end up that CT center does benefit. We were not satisfied with that, and particularly the governor was not satisfied with that, and that's why he directed Gear 1 funds to be directed towards the CTE centers. So that initial Gear 1, I think, was $4.2 million. That was directed, back at that moment in time, it was really about reopening costs. So CTE centers were addressed through Gear 1. In our initial conversations with the governor, I believe he's inclined to do something similar with Gear 2. Again, since their needs are not necessarily well addressed through ESSER, unless there's sort of that Rutland City example. Is that correct, Jill? Pretty much.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that as we're looking ahead to ESSER 2 and 3, we are sort of beginning to identify those groups within an LEA whose voice needs to be more.
Well, but in the Northeast Kingdom, as you know, we've got 2 CTEs that are associated with our independent schools.
Right.
And they did receive Gear funding. As part of there was a consortium agreement, and so they did receive specifically Gear funding.
But these are also, Senator Kitchell, good examples of what we might need to use the state set aside money for, because, again, we're not really sure at this point what the next phase of our work will be. We know there's learning loss. We know there's a need to attend to, issues of professional development and so forth. But part of the idea of giving SEA some discretionary funding is to address these issues as they emerge. So it would be, I'd hate to lose, basically my message here, I don't keep beating a dead horse, but I don't want to lose our flexibility in deploying those funds at such an early part of the emergency. Essentially, I know people are thinking this is the end, but in terms of education recovery, this is just the beginning, which is why these funds go out to 2023. So I'm just really want to be cautious about, spending them on one-off programs when we might have some strategic need that we could really address.
Well, one would hope with as much that's going out to the schools, they would, with the right guidance, could, it seems to me their goal should be the same, and that is the educational needs of their students. So it seems like it has to be looked at both levels and locally in terms of the resources going out and how they're allocated. And then if there's certain anomalies that have to be addressed at the state level, whether it's the CTE centers that are attached to our independence or any other issues that might come up. But there's a lot of money going out to the schools. I'm interested in those issues that transcend district boundaries, because I think within districts, they're going to have more than sufficient funding. But when we start looking at like regional issues or even groups of districts that might be satellites around a CT center that's not part of a district, like in the case of the LI or St. J Academy, that's a place where the state level funds could really fill a niche if we need to. Okay.
Could you use this money for broadband or to expand that out so that you could get better service for the students?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll invite Jill to chip in here. But it's an example, I think, again, of why we need to sit down and really look at all the money that's available for broadband. So we have, just to walk through, this topic. We have inside of ESSER, districts are going to have significant funding available, and yes, they could spend it on broadband. Again, they're going to be limited to their district boundary, so they're not necessarily going to go out and build cell towers, but they're going to have money to do some things with parents and students and devices and connectivity. Similarly, the state level money could be used, the SEA set aside could be used that way. But we also have other appropriations under ARPA that are focused on connectivity as well. So we have an increase in E-rate funding, which states school districts can pull down. We have a separate appropriation for schools and libraries. And I think there's something additionally under sort of the capital bill provisions of ARPA. So there's a lot of broadband pieces. Commissioner Tierney and I are going to meet on this just so we can have our arms around all the different subcomponents of ARPA. But I think there's what's emerging for me is a strategic opportunity for us as a state to really make some progress on broadband if we can sort of wrap our arms around all the moving parts of ESSER and ARPA.
Yeah, there's and I know that there's a bill coming out of House Technology that's really looking at the rollout of broadband, because that is one of the permissible uses. So other questions?
I'm just always amazed at our use of these terms, ESSER and Arbor.
Yeah,
and
Senator, I think we're prone to that somewhat more in education. I mean, we
really need a
dictionary,
a dictionary or a cheat sheet for those of us who aren't regularly in it. I mean, I've got an opinion, I got a view now of what they are, but you know, if I tried to explain it tomorrow, I'd fumble all over it.
Mm-hmm. Well,
but you guys just use it like it's, you know.
Well, we have the problem. We create them even when we're not required to create them. So Jill and I've had those conversations. Like, you know, whose acronym is that? Is that the Feds, or is it something we came up with? You know.
Okay. Other questions or information? I'm just looking at the clock here.
We're happy to go through the budget in more detail. We have the usual layout for you, whatever's convenient. Yeah. And, you know, we just thought it was important to put the federal issue on your table front and center.
Well, I think that is important. I mean, there are a whole host of issues around education, certainly, and the impact the pandemic has had on, and I've got one school in my district. I guess I haven't had in-person classes all year. So
which one's that?
I think St. Johnsbury School District was one.
Oh, well, they've been hybrid for a bit.
Well, maybe they have been now, but there was concern earlier. So there's no question that there's a lot of work. I'll tell you from our education committee, and you must know this, and that is the literacy initiative. And I know that you are cautioning us about spending money, but we did feel that the education committee's efforts to really start tackling an area where Vermont students are, where the data show we are not doing as well as we should by those students by grade 3. So hopefully that's an example of taking data and looking at where we need to put some resources and help our teachers, our educators acquire the skills to be able to teach the different reading needs, because that's kind of if there's anything
no, absolutely,
our students need, it's a capacity to read. So we will try to be vigilant. Our goal is use this money in a way, and that's what we've done with the CRF to the extent we can, for investments that give us long-term benefit. And so that's going to be part of how we're divvying it up. The other thing we're also going to be focusing on is how to use and recognize this is one-time money. And right. So we've got to be very cautious about what it is we're spending and the extent to which either deliberately or inadvertently building higher costs as a result, because that ongoing base obligation can create a lot of budget pressure out into the future. So other questions of the folks from AOE today? Okay.
If I can just very, very quickly, I had heard Senator Starr in a previous committee meeting expressing concern about some reporting and how, we'll sort of understand how these funds are being used. So I just wanted to sort of provide a little bit of information, there are reporting requirements around ESSER, around specific categories of use. We have not had to do that yet because as of the last year, we didn't have any out at that time, but that is something that will happen moving forward. And with ESSER 2, there's a specific reporting requirement around how LEAs are using the funds to address learning loss. So there is some information that we will be able to get and also be able to report out to all of you as well.
Okay. We assumed that there would be federal reporting requirements and that those reports would be available to you and ultimately available to the legislative committees. Okay. All right, other comments or whatever? Thank you. Appreciate your coming today, and we still have a lot of work ahead of us. And I'm sure you've been taking a look at what we've done relative to education-related spending in our bill that we're passing out. We passed out of committee. So our goal is recognizing and particularly assisting. And we did this, an example was with the Efficiency Vermont partnership consultation that was provided to schools, and knowing, requirements and the technology and so forth. I've heard really good things from schools about how they benefited from that resource. And so I know that there's not a warm reception, I think, on the agency's part about providing resources to give that kind of same consultation to schools, but so much money.
We're in favor of that. The issue for us was FEMA and how that would work. We're advocates of putting more money into that program. It's very successful, but we were concerned about what was being proposed as a contractual relationship in order to leverage FEMA, and that's problematic from our standpoint.
No, I understand that. So hopefully we'll continue to do our best, and I'm sure if there's something that is particularly troublesome or you don't view as permissible, would be hearing from you.
Well, we're happy to help in any way we can. We appreciate your work and your support. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So committee, we're wrapping up with education today. So we've finished our scheduled testimony, and so I'm going to